Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today, COVID-19 Vaccines. I'm Deborah Miller, founder and CEO of Cure Duchenne, and today I'm representing the Duchenne community. Our son Håkon, who is living with Duchenne, just turned 24 last week. We all know the cardiac and respiratory implications of Duchenne, and like you, we're very concerned about COVID as it directly impacts the heart and lungs. I'm very grateful to the esteemed speakers on today's panel. The physicians speaking today are deeply involved in treating Duchenne patients during a very trying time. And the representatives from the FDA, CDC, and Pfizer are currently at the epicenter of developing, reviewing, and directing COVID vaccines. I'm not sure you could find busier people in the world today, and we very much appreciate their time to address the Duchenne community. And we are thankful the public and private partnerships have expedited the vaccine development for this terrible virus in record time. Dr. Mike Kelly, Cure Duchenne's Chief Scientific Officer, will be moderating today's panel discussion. Mike, would you please welcome our panelists?
I sure will, and thank you, Deborah. Let me also add my welcome to the online audience for joining us this afternoon. And one final bit of housekeeping, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A in this webinar, and I'll be posing questions to the panel. And you can submit yours from your screen on the Q&A button. We'll try our best to get to them during this here hour, and if not, we'll follow up after this is finished. So today, we're joined by an accomplished panel whose expertise covers many aspects of the clinical and regulatory development of vaccines, as well as physicians directly focused on treating patients with rare disease. It's my pleasure to welcome, in alphabetical order, Dr. Bill Gruber, the SVP of Pfizer's Vaccine Clinical Research with responsibility for global clinical vaccine development. Dr. Peter Marks, the Director for the Center of Biological Evaluation at the FDA. Dr. Kathy Matthews, the Vice Chair of Clinical Investigation in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Iowa. Dr. Hank Meyer, the Director of the Pulmonary Function Laboratories at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Deborah Miller, our founder and CEO. And Dr. Georgina Peacock, the Director of the CDC's Division of Human Development and Disability at the National Center of Birth Defects and Development Disabilities. The members of the panel will more fully introduce themselves during their opening remarks in a few minutes, but I'd like to say up front and repeat what Deborah says, which is how much we appreciate them taking the time out of a very busy schedules to be with us today. We're very grateful that they could join in. So let me begin by setting the stage before we open it up to the panel. The worldwide COVID-19 pandemic has proven to be a leading threat to our health and a major disruptor of our normal way of life this past 12 months. It has impacted everything we previously have taken for granted and left whole countries, communities, and families scrambling and wondering how to react to this new normal as we begin 2021. Soberingly, COVID-19 is currently the leading cause of death of Americans, overtaking deaths associated with heart disease and cancer. The pace of the worldwide effort to develop a COVID-19 vaccine has been unprecedented, and the recent emergency use authorizations for the vaccines developed by Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna is a prime example of the capacity to accomplish previously unthinkable goals. It demonstrates the ability of companies, patients, and regulators working together to achieve a common goal. Operation Warp Speed here in the US is a great example of a successful collaboration between the US government agencies and the private sector. The approval of the first two vaccines are welcome and much needed, and we expect others to be added to this list with candidates from J&J and AstraZeneca and the University of Oxford expected to seek emergency use authorization within the next few months. This expanding list of vaccine types brings with it the need to inform and educate the community on the differences between them, differences such as dosing regimens, mechanism of action, whether mRNA-based, such as Pfizer and Moderna, adenovirus-based, like AstraZeneca and J&J, live attenuated or inactivated vaccines. And importantly, whether or not to get vaccinated and which type of vaccine to get also needs to be addressed and discussed, especially understanding how it may impact a person's ability to participate in a clinical trial. The two approved vaccines are remarkably effective. They require 2 doses and are approved to treat patients 16 years or older for Pfizer and 18 years or older for Moderna. This age limitation has sweeping ramifications for the majority of Duchenne patients who are younger than 16 and should be discussed in terms of the ability to adequately conduct pediatric COVID clinical trials, the importance of getting vaccinated, the risk for unvaccinated Duchenne patients and other rare disease patients who may consider attending events such as summer camps, for example, and the willingness of the regulatory agencies to consider broadening the label to include younger patients sooner rather than later. COVID-19, like its related coronaviruses, SARS and MERS, is characterized as a respiratory virus, and we've learned that it may present an increased risk to develop serious illness in those with underlying medical problems like cardiovascular disease and chronic respiratory disease. This should be discussed as it has obvious implications for treating Duchenne patients. And it's also important to consider female manifesting carriers who quite often are diagnosed with muscle and cardiac issues, specifically cardiomyopathy. And finally, many new COVID-19 mutations have been identified during the past year in patients around the world. And the impact of these new strains and whether the vaccines continue to be effective or not should also be addressed. So before we begin to discuss some of today's questions, I'll invite the panel to introduce themselves with some opening comments. So again, in alphabetical order, Dr. Bill Gruber.
Yeah, so thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with everybody here today. My name is Bill Gruber. I head vaccine clinical research and development for Pfizer. I've been involved in vaccine development for over 35 years and with Pfizer and its legacy companies for 20 years. I'm trained as a pediatrician, so I have some personal knowledge in having cared for individuals with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and other muscular dystrophies, and I have a specialty in infectious diseases. And I look forward to sharing the good news about the vaccine and providing information that people will find helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Dr. Peter Marks.
Hi, I'm Peter Marks from FDA. We're the center from FDA at Center for Biologics that reviews and approves vaccines or issues emergency use authorizations. And basically, it has been quite a year of watching vaccines come from conception through to the emergency use authorization procedure. And it's quite exciting to see these deployed right now. And so we'll look forward today to try to respond to questions about the vaccines that have come along to date and what might be on the horizon.
Thank you, Peter. Dr. Kathy Matthews.
Hello, thank you for the invitation to join you. I'm a pediatric neurologist and neuromuscular specialist at the University of Iowa and take care of children with a variety and adults with a variety of neuromuscular diseases here. So I think my only comment, starting comment would be that while, as you mentioned, children are not yet able to get the vaccine, we are fortunate because children also tend not to get severe disease. So our young children with Duchenne tend not to be as sick, and that's a positive thing. Start out with a positive.
Thank you, Kathy. Dr. Hank Meyer.
Yes, I'm Hank Meyer. I'm a pediatric pulmonologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania. I've had the privilege of taking care of a variety of different patients with neuromuscular disease with a particular interest in Duchenne muscular dystrophy and the respiratory manifestations. And as Dr. Matthews just mentioned, this has been a journey going through the COVID pandemic and seeing the impact on children, which thankfully has been less substantial than what's been reported in adults. And I look forward to having a robust discussion about the implications of COVID and the vaccine in our patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Hank. Deborah Miller, our own panelists. Deborah, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, I already introduced myself a little bit, but again, I'll just emphasize that our son Håkan is 24 years old, and we're happy to see that the younger guys seem to be doing well, but we have deep, deep concern for our older Duchenne patients and want to make sure that, we get all of our questions answered. And I know that today's going to be a very robust discussion. And I just want to thank you again for being here.
And thank you for that. And finally, Dr. Georgina Peacock.
Hi, so I'm Georgina Peacock. I'm a developmental pediatrician by training and work at CDC and the Division of Human Development and Disability and the National Center on Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities. Though, as many of my colleagues at CDC have this year, I've worked probably more time in the COVID-19 response than in my regular job, but with a great focus on making sure that we're attending to the needs of people with disabilities and other populations that are disproportionately affected. And and most recently in the vaccine task force, where we were working with states to make sure that the vaccine was distributed, and obviously that is still going. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Georgina. I'm going to start with the questions and start with Peter. And I think it's important really to set the stage based on where we are and the progress that's been made, and recognizing that a tremendous amount not only has been achieved, but we're expecting ramp ups this year. So Peter, the first question from me is, could you provide an update on where we are today with Operation Warp Speed? Now that we've witnessed the rollout of the first approved drugs, and perhaps speak to what we can expect to see happen over the next few months?
Right. So kind of the latest thing to say is that it may transition. It may be the operation that was formerly known as Operation Warp Speed, because the Biden administration will probably rename it something else. And then they've said they're intending to do so. That said, Operation Warp Speed had 6 vaccines that they chose to bring forward ultimately into phase 3 trials. They were relatively balanced between 3 categories of vaccines. The mRNA vaccines, both of which now, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, have been given emergency use authorization. 2 of the vaccines were in the class of non-replicating viral vectors. Those include one from AstraZeneca, which has been deployed in some places across the globe, but for which a phase 3 trial is still ongoing in the United States, and another from Janssen or J&J, which is another adenoviral, human adenoviral vectored vaccine that is currently very close to finishing and reading out from its phase 3 trial. So that's another 2. And the final 2 are protein-based vaccines, protein subunit-based vaccines, which are a very conventional vaccine. Lots of kids get protein subunit-based vaccines of one sort or another, and adults do too. And the 2 that are in development, one in development by a company called Novavax, that's in phase 3 trials now, and another by Sanofi, which is in phase 2 trials, working its way back into phase 3. So that's the kind of the portfolio, and I think probably we'll expect in the next couple of weeks that we might see another emergency use authorization application, probably from Janssen, then probably following that, possibly one from AstraZeneca. And these will be very important, because the larger diversity of vaccines we have as long as they meet a standard for effectiveness, that will be very helpful, because the sooner we're all vaccinated, the better we will be in terms of getting back to normal life, so we can get to some type of herd immunity.
Excellent, thank you. It's worth just sort of fleshing out a little extra comment there on the J&J vaccine, where we're seeing it quite different, particularly with the logistics of moving that around with less temperature requirements, a single dose. Is there a comment you could make on that? Because it does reflect, a nice counterbalance to what we have today.
Right. So right now, just to make it clear so that everyone understands the context there, the Pfizer vaccine has to be stored at ultra cold temperatures, the kind of freezers that aren't generally in doctors' offices. The Moderna vaccine has to be stored in a freezer, and both of them have to obviously be shipped cold. The ability to have a vaccine that does not have to be necessarily be shipped on ice would be very helpful. Additionally, the availability of a vaccine that is one and done, as opposed to having to come back for a second vaccine, would be very nice as well. Obviously, though, it has to have the kind of effectiveness that I think we've come to expect now from these vaccines. So we'll have to see where the effectiveness is. But if one had a sufficiently effective vaccine that one could just give once, it would be very helpful in the population. And again, the ability not to have to keep something in a freezer or transported on ice or dry ice will be helpful, and particularly in places that don't have the kind of resources like we have in the United States with electricity everywhere.
Yeah, very useful. Thank you. I'm going to keep the same theme, Peter, but I bring in Bill on this. The time taken from work in the research laboratory to actually achieving emergency use approval for the first COVID-19 vaccine from Pfizer it happened at an unprecedented pace. Can you comment on the robustness of the process that was in there, and particularly from a risk-benefit profile? You know, that I think constantly reassuring the community and the world out there about this and the standards that we're applying is particularly important.
Yeah, Michael, it's a good question. I mean, I think what the public needs to understand is that there were no corners cut in terms of doing the necessary work to assure the safety of the vaccine and the effectiveness. What happened is that a lot of the white space was eliminated, and Peter knows this well, that typically we're dealing with a number of different vaccines which are under review at the same time by the likes of the FDA. And there's a cadence that typically occurs when one gets to the end of phase one. You submit information, you essentially go back and forth with regulatory agencies and move into phase two, and that can last a matter of months. What I really give credit to the FDA for is they worked in close collaboration. It was hard to imagine anything that had a higher priority than developing a COVID-19 vaccine. And I think the FDA, took that position as well. And so consequently, we were actually able to work as we moved from phase one through phase two into phase three, where we examined the efficacy of the vaccine in near real time. I can tell you from the time we are actually submitting data in real time, so that we didn't have to wait till the whole package was complete and then have the FDA review it. They were reviewing it in real time, so that by the time we got to the end of phase one, it was literally a matter of days before we had the FDA approval to move into phase three. And that was based on a typical comprehensive review of all the safety data, all the immune response data, the ability of the vaccine to make an immune response that was likely to associate with protection, that then allowed us to move into phase three. And then the same thing happened there. As we moved into phase three and demonstrated the efficacy, we built in the opportunity that if we were lucky and the vaccine had high efficacy, and I'll frankly tell you that the level of efficacy that we ended up demonstrating was higher than I anticipated. We'd actually designed the study in a way that could detect a lower amount of efficacy, which meant you needed to have more subjects followed for a longer period of time to demonstrate that. And so it was a great relief, frankly, in thinking about the potential to get to a vaccine quickly, to find that at our first interim analysis, the vaccine had 95% efficacy. So I think the public can be reassured that throughout all this process, appropriate things have been done to monitor the safety. We had an independent data monitoring committee that basically looked at the data. This is unprecedented in my experience, where they were looking at this weekly in real time with us. And they had the advantage. We were blinded, as were the people receiving the vaccine, as to whether or not individuals were receiving vaccine or placebo during the trial. But the DMC could look at unblinded information. So they could quickly determine if there was something that suggested a potential safety risk with the vaccine. So real credit to their diligence and interest in helping us move this along. And as I said, real credit to the FDA for the comprehensive and timely review of information in real time that made this possible.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think credit and congratulations to many people that are involved in there. And I heard earlier comments about the role of patients that played in here getting involved as well.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
let me again, I think the most heroic individuals, and again, I will share the same vignette that I shared offline just very quickly, that we had individuals that obviously were enrolling in phase 1 with a technology that we thought offered promise, but we couldn't be certain was going to prove effective and safe. And they volunteered to not only get the vaccine, but have blood specimens taken, to be probed with nasal swabs at intervals when they had symptoms. So they're incredible heroes. And some of these individuals, it turned out, were heroes the second time around. These are now older adults in many instances who, at the end of the study, proudly also brought in their polio pioneer pins that they had actually volunteered as children to receive vaccine in the 1950s. So a real credit to those individuals. They were heroic 2 times over.
Yeah, and I give a real tip of the hat to Pfizer for including 16 years and upwards. You know, that there broadens the range out there to an all-important population.
Well, again, let me give, not to make Peter's head swell, but let me just give a little bit of, some of the reasoning behind that. The FDA has generally viewed that 16 to 17-year-olds are very much like 18-year-olds. So we were able to take the very extensive data set in the older individuals, 18 above, and add to the 16, because we're very intent. All the issues aside as to the significance and how common severe disease is, we're still very intent and have an obligation to move into the pediatric age group. And this was a way that in cooperation with the FDA, we're able to do that, to supplement the file with the 16 to 17-year-olds. And we were grateful that in the end, the indication included that age group. And we're not done yet.
Yep, fantastic. One thing about it, as we've witnessed all this success, there's always anticipation on the other side of the equal sign, and everybody's now looking for it. Can you give a comment where Pfizer is as far as production and supply and logistics in there, and how that's being ramped up?
Yeah, I think, it's a real credit to Pfizer leadership, and we're not unique in this regard, for making a decision at risk before we even knew whether we had a vaccine that was likely to be successful, to gear up to manufacturing the millions and ultimately hundreds of millions and potentially billions of doses that are going to be required to deal with this pandemic on a global scale. And so all of that has been done. I would argue that at least to this point, and I think you've seen public information, that there's been less of an issue in terms of supply being adequate, at least I can speak from a Pfizer perspective, as opposed to distribution. We obviously need to get the distribution issues settled so that we actually are getting vaccine out and into people's arms. You may have seen that there are other things we've been doing to try to maximize the number of doses that we can get. So originally, the vials were designed in the context of thinking that a routine syringe might be used with a routine amount of dead space, which meant that you could get 5 doses per vial. But we quickly came to the conclusion, well, gee, if you used a syringe with less dead space, you could actually get 6 doses. Now, okay, 6 versus 5, that may not mean much if you're only talking about a handful of doses, but if you're talking about 100 million doses, suddenly that's 20 million doses more that you potentially could have. And so we again worked with the FDA to find a way to include that information in the label, and now that affords an opportunity to expand dosing. I'll just say that the other thing, I want to come back to the issue that Peter raised about the cold chain. He's absolutely right. The Pfizer vaccine has to be kept at incredibly cold temperatures during shipment. It can be kept in a refrigerator for 5 days after it's thawed. So it's not like you have to use it immediately upon thawing, but that's still a limiting factor, right? Less so in a pandemic situation where you have a lot of people coming through very quickly. If we begin to move out of that, becomes less tractable, and it certainly is less tractable for remote areas, even in the United States and certainly throughout the world. So we're very interested and very earnest in looking at other formulations. And one of the formulations we're looking at is a potential lyophilized, or if you will, a freeze-dried product that could be reconstituted, would not be as dependent on that sort of temperature management. And we'll be starting those trials mid-year. So, we are earnest about providing supply, but we anticipate, again, we're going to have in the many hundreds of millions of doses for delivery to the United States and the rest of the world this year.
Okay, one final quick question. I've seen this on the news that literally prompts this one from me. And really commenting on the importance of the second booster dose. We've heard conflicting reports that the dose may be flexible. What's the advice right now around that?
Yeah, I think our data supports the use of 2 doses. And the reason for that is even though we see some efficacy probably beginning at least by 12 days after the first dose of vaccine, we don't know how durable that protection is because we don't have the data, because everybody in our trial got a second dose at 21 days. One of the things that we do know is something that we consider very important or likely to be important for long life protection is the presence of neutralizing antibody. And we don't see very much after the first dose. So the protection we're seeing after that first dose is likely or potentially due to something else. It could be what we call cell-mediated immune response, generating a cellular immune response that kills virus before it can actually establish itself and produce disease. But for the longer term, a second dose is important. Our vaccine was studied with a 21-day interval. We actually allowed for individuals to take the vaccine between 19 and 42 days so that there was a reason, for temporary reasons, they couldn't make it into the clinic or they had an underlying illness that precluded them from getting the second dose right on time. That was allowed. But it's important to say that most of our data is very clustered around that 21 days. So we don't know for certain that a longer interval is likely to be as protective. I think we have some confidence that it likely is based on our experience with other vaccines. And I think that's why you're seeing, advisory committees, certainly outside the United States and to some extent in the United States, talk about the potential for people to get a second dose farther apart. We just don't have the data to support that. But in the end, I think advisory committees will have to make a judgment as to whether that's required, particularly in the setting of supply issues or distribution issues. If a person, if there's not vaccine at the site, you're not going to abandon all hope and say, well, don't give them the vaccine because they didn't make it on the 21st day. If they get there on the 30th, the 42nd, they should still get the vaccine. I think they'll actually be well protected beyond that point.
Useful, thank you. I wanted the community to hear that because there are some conflicting noise that's going on around that. I want to switch gears slightly and move to Dr. Matthews and Dr. Myers and really sort of pose a question that's drafted, at least I've drafted it this way. COVID-19, like its relative SARS and MERS, is characterized as a respiratory virus and appears to present an increased risk to develop serious illness in those with underlying medical problems like cardiovascular disease or respiratory disease. Would you comment on the increased risk as it relates to Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy patients, in particular for female manifesting carriers of this disease who quite often are diagnosed with skeletal muscle and cardiac issues, specifically dilated cardiomyopathy?
Yeah, so any respiratory virus, whether it's SARS, whether it's MERS, whether it's influenza, rhinovirus, or any of the players we see every year, poses a substantial risk to anybody with chronic respiratory conditions, be it cardiomyopathy, chronic respiratory failure, or the like. And so it's hard at this point to extricate COVID-19 and talk specifically about it because we really haven't seen it much in pediatrics and certainly not in patients with neuromuscular disease. Having said that, that speaks to one of the benefits of what we've gone through over the last 10 months or so, which is that we've isolated from each other, which has obviously social negative outcomes, but we're also effectively separating patients with acute illness from others, and that's decreased the incidence both of influenza and the typical respiratory viruses we see. And I think has really had a major impact in preventing transmission of COVID through the Duchenne community. And that's something that I think while we talk about the linchpin of all of this, which is vaccination, and getting to the point where there's enough immunity through the community, the heavy lifting has been done at home and providing exquisitely good care and aggressive management when needed.
I completely agree, Hank. It's and we have had relatively few neuromuscular patients who've been sick, and those who have been exposed and gotten and tested and been shown to have COVID have typically done well, and that includes the young adults that I take care of.
Very good. It's to the similar sort of question, there's some evidence out there that myalgia is a possible side effect from the vaccination against COVID-19. And is there a risk to Duchenne patients and Becker patients from rhabdomyolysis or other conditions there during the vaccination process? Is that a concern that you may have?
I would say no. And before I go to answer that, can I also address, in the previous question you had asked about carriers?
Mm-hmm.
So very briefly, I think if you are a known carrier and you are known to have cardiomyopathy, that would put you in an increased risk category. If you are a carrier who has completely normal cardiopulmonary function, then I would view you in the same risk as the rest of your age group and whatever other health conditions. So sorry, I didn't address that earlier. The rhabdomyolysis, the myalgia is not typically associated with rhabdomyolysis, and I do not think that I'm not aware of any increased risk of rhabdomyolysis with the vaccination, and would not make that fear make you not get it. The risks of COVID far exceed any risk of muscle injury.
Well, thank you. These patients, considering the standard of care in Duchenne, should immunocompromised patients receive the vaccine, in particular those on chronic steroid use, where potentially it could blunt the protective immune effects and the immune response to the vaccination? How do you read that scenario, given that steroids are the standard of care in this disease?
In theory, there should be no adverse event from being on steroids unless you talk about the response to the vaccine, meaning there is the potential that the vaccine may not have the same immunogenic response that you would see in somebody not on chronic steroids. All we can do is hypothesize at this point because we just don't have the data. One of the things that the run-in to getting pediatric approval will do with the millions of frontline practitioners, frontline people who are getting vaccinated now, is that there is a very robust tracking that's being done that should allow us to answer some of those questions before we get to the point where vaccination will be open to our patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Very good. We've heard small amounts of side effects associated with allergic reactions to treatment with the first two vaccines that have been approved. What's your measure of concern around that, particularly with muscular dystrophy patients? And is there a way to perhaps pre-screen for individuals that are more susceptible to that? And have you any comments that you could add to the community there?
I'm not aware of any way to screen. I know of individuals who have pre-existing lots of allergies and have done okay with the vaccine. I think the only, and Dr. Peacock could address this, I think the only CDC recommendation for not giving it is a personal serious adverse event or serious reaction to the vaccine.
Okay, thank you. Deborah, let me ask you, as a mother of an older boy, the sort of advice that you would have, for continuing to protect our young men and older individuals in this disease?
My advice is, I think we're so close to having the vaccines available for our sons that we just need to continue to be vigilant and keep them home as much as possible. And for us that have to go out to the market or, if we have to work outside the home, just continue to take as many precautions as possible. I think there's been an interesting phenomena with our guys with Duchenne, and that a lot of the rest of the world and their friends are actually experiencing their life now. And so they're perhaps a silver lining for these guys, and that their social life has actually in some ways expanded because of online interactions. But my advice is just be vigilant, hang in there. And, we'll just continue working as hard as we can to get these patients prioritized. And I'm very interested to hear the discussion amongst our panelists about the prioritization of Duchenne patients and other rare diseases when it comes to vaccine distribution. I know that it seems to be rather inconsistent amongst the states and even amongst the counties. And I know that we've had some queries from parents in different states wondering, why certain groups of communities are prioritized over rare diseases. That I think it's so important to get these vaccines to our patients.
Yeah, you're actually reading my mind. My next question was to Dr. Peacock, and it was essentially that about how are the decisions made about who gets the vaccine and when, commenting on the distribution to various patient groups. I believe you're on mute.
You're right. Okay, sorry. The advisory
That's okay.
on immunization practices, or ACIP, is a group that advises CDC. It's comprised of medical and public health experts, and they make recommendations on the use of vaccines in the civilian population. And so they work using sort of scientific data. They look at the feasibility of implementation, and then they used 4 different ethical principles as they came up with their initial recommendations for allocation of COVID-19. And these were, so when supply was limited, to maximize the benefits and minimize harms, to promote justice, mitigate health inequities, and then promote transparency. And so in doing that, what they recommended was a phased approach. And I think many of you have probably heard of these different phases. But in phase 1A, that is a healthcare professional and then long-term care facility residents due to their high risk of exposure to COVID-19 and risk for severe disease. Then phase 1B included persons 75 years of age or older and frontline essential workers. And then phase 1C, where many of where people with Duchenne may fit, would be in persons, so in 1C, persons 65 to 74 years old, and then persons 16 to 64 years old with a high-risk medical condition. And then in addition to that, any essential workers not recommended in phase 1A or B. Having said that, these provide recommendations to jurisdictions, to states, and the final decision on vaccine distribution within a jurisdiction rests on that jurisdiction or on that state. And so that's, I think, why we've been hearing different applications of these recommendations in different jurisdictions, even at the local level. So the local level, at the state level, and so on.
Dr. Peacock, can I ask a follow-up question on that? Is there anything a rare disease community could do within their own particular state to bring awareness that would provide more equity for rare disease patients?
So in the vaccine planning that happened in the initial, so when jurisdictions were doing the initial planning and got funding from the CDC, one of the things that they were required to do in every, what I'm calling jurisdiction, which means a state, or it could be a large city or a territory, they were asked to put together a vaccine committee. And this vaccine committee has the purview, or was supposed to have the purview of looking at equity, looking at priority populations, and how to distribute sort of limited amounts of vaccine. As I said, I just rolled off the vaccine task force, but as I was rolling off, we were doing these hour-long conversations with each of the 64 jurisdictions, asking how they were prioritizing different populations. In many cases, the states were using these vaccine committees to help them make those decisions about allocation. So I think connecting with, that's one strategy, is to connect in either at the state level, and then I think even in some cases at the local level, they have similar advisory groups. Connecting with those groups who are making the decision about how to use this very scarce resource right now is a really good strategy to use.
Oh, thank you. Does it complicate the matter that there's different state or different county problems or overlook, as far as the run out of these vaccines?
It's certainly, I mean, it's the way our country works. We have states that have the prerogative to decide how to take care of their residents. And I think that, there are certainly groups that should have priority in vaccine distribution. And what we are seeing is that when there's a limited amount of vaccine, it creates a lot of challenges. I do think some of the things that have been suggested in recent days about, maybe having some other federal entities such as FEMA and others, or federally qualified health centers, who may also be places where the vaccines can be administered, will be helpful, because I think what we need to do is make sure that we are reaching those populations that need to be reached to prevent severe disease.
Okay, thank you. It's clear that what we've learned over the last year, there's significant mutations to this virus, and some questions are concerned about particular types that may render them inactive against the vaccines. Is there a comment that you could make on that would allow us to focus on, there is coverage for existing ones, or we're planning on testing them against different strains as we recognize them out there?
So viruses constantly change through mutation. So that's something that we know about viruses, and that new variants show up. So we know there's multiple COVID-19 variants that are circulating. We've heard about some that have recently emerged in the United Kingdom and South Africa. As you know, as we've discussed, there's 2 vaccines that are currently available under emergency use, and both of these vaccines, through being messenger RNA vaccines, help teach the cells how to, or they trigger an immune response inside our body for future infection. And because the response you get is kind of what we call a polyclonal response, or it's a response that will respond in different ways to that virus coming in, we do believe there would need to be multiple mutations in order for a vaccine not to work. Having said that, we don't have sufficient information right now about whether the current COVID-19 vaccines that are authorized under the emergency use authorization will protect against the new variants. And we are monitoring those closely with other federal agencies to look at that. But I would also suggest that maybe my colleagues, either Dr. Marks or Dr. Gruber, may have some comments on that as well.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe I can comment, and Peter, you can obviously comment. Georgina's right. From a protection point of view, the jury's still out, because we don't have enough disease out there to get a sense of the potential. However, both internally to Pfizer as well as other groups have looked at the UK strain and the South African strain too, that are particularly prominent now. A potential concern. And I think the information so far has been reassuring that for the UK strain, the data looks quite good. For the South African strain, there might be, in those people that are immunized, somewhat of a less of an immune response in terms of killing the virus, but it's not to the extent that we think that virus is likely to escape. Time will tell. But I think the important part of this is, certainly it's gratifying that we're potentially not seeing that potential right now, but it doesn't mean that potential could not occur in the future. In other words, we may yet see a mutation or mutations that confer, the ability for a virus to escape the vaccine. And so we're actually engaged now, and I'm sure other sponsors of vaccines are, in thinking proactively, okay, what do we need to be doing now to prepare for that eventuality, so we don't have a 9-month period from the time of identifying the isolate to actually having a vaccine. And this is again going to require some cooperation with our regulatory colleagues about the best approach to quickly identifying that, yes, you make the new vaccine for the new construct, it's likely to be as effective as the prior vaccine. So we're earnestly working to try to prevent a future where a virus manages to escape.
Yeah, well said. I think it really takes us being vigilant and sequencing much more of these variants as soon as we can actually identify them and making sure that we're still covered. Peter, do you want to throw a comment in on that?
I would throw in 2 comments to this. I think going back to circle back to what we were talking about, getting both vaccines on schedule if you can. What we do know is that when you get these vaccines on schedule, we know the extent of the immune response that one gets. And in the setting of a place where we have mutant strains that are potentially going to ultimately be somewhat more resistant, I think we want people to have the greatest immune response that they can here. So to the extent we in the United States feel it's important to do so, we are encouraging people to get the vaccine regimen as it is labeled. Obviously, if one has to get the second dose a little late, 2 weeks late because of something comes up, it's better to get it than not get it, right? So we're not going to say don't get it, but I think the jury is going to be out, and I would really caution. I feel all I can say is I've cautioned my I don't want to be silent in this. I've cautioned some of our global regulatory colleagues that there could be a false economy for going for one dose here, because if the protection is less than adequate, if it turns out that it's shorter than it might be, or that the extent of the protection is lower, that may be a false economy. And we already are starting to hear reports coming out of Israel that a single dose strategy was not really making it the way they thought. So that's number one. And number two, I think what we do know is from what we've now seen with the evolution to the South African variant is that we are going to have to be hyper vigilant around the globe for what might emerge. And it also means we're going to be ready not to get surprised if there's further evolution, and we'll be ready to take care of it. I'm not trying to scare anyone that there could be further evolution of this virus, but rather say that we will be prepared for it so that if we have to, we can react very rapidly. And that is actually one of the other advantages of these mRNA platforms. One can change a strain relatively quickly, and we don't have all the details worked out yet, but we are working internally, and we'll work with the manufacturers to work out the details in case that's necessary. So I just don't want people to panic. Yes, we may see further evolution, but we have surveillance systems that have been put up to detect those mutants, both in the United States and elsewhere. And I think in the United States, our surveillance systems are going to get much more robust in the coming weeks to months. And then we have something to do about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think to me personally, that there's a really important part of the whole vigilance that we've got over this, and just continue to monitor that there going forward, and being prepared to react to, as you say, Bill, with this sort of technology, we can do that fairly rapidly. I'll take this now, I'll just move it along a little bit, but as we go further into 2021, we'll see many of the individuals across different groups and tiers get vaccinated. When would you expect to see the impact of the pandemic lessen as a result of that? And we'll get closer to what people call herd immunity in some sense, or normalcy. As you look at the rollout that we've got and what's planned with J&J coming online rather soon and AstraZeneca, is there a way that we can start to predict? Georgina, I'll look at you first.
Oh, okay, sorry. Experts don't know yet what percentage of people we need to achieve herd immunity. We do know that as the more people get vaccinated, the closer we are to get to that. And what herd immunity does is it makes it hard for a disease to spread from person to person. So it even protects, some people who can't be vaccinated, for example. We don't know that exact percentage for this COVID vaccine. And that's why I think at least in the near term, we need to use all of our tools that we have to address this pandemic, including wearing masks and social distancing and washing hands and getting vaccinated. So the thing that really, as vaccine becomes more available, making sure that we have that the people do have access to this vaccine, and also make sure that we are hearing some concerns about vaccine hesitancy, and we have sort of an approach at CDC called Vaccinate with Confidence that is trying to talk about some of those myths around vaccine hesitancy so that people feel confident that this is truly a way that we're going to be able to move on from this pandemic, which I think is all of our goals, so that we can return to whatever that normalcy is.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to move back to Hank and Kathy and Deborah, taking that their point. One doesn't know where herd immunity would begin, whether it's at 70%, whether it's at 90%, it depends on a lot of different factors that are out there. So from a community perspective, is there advice or specific changes or recommendations that you start to make for neuromuscular patients and Duchenne patients in particular? Kathy, I'll look at you first and say, is there any specific things that you want to talk to the community about?
So first of all, I would say whether you're a caregiver or a patient, if somebody offers you the vaccine, say yes. Do not say, my grandmother really needs it more than me. If somebody offers you the vaccine, say yes, even if you don't think you're ready or you deserve it. So take it if it's offered. Number two is, I think maybe one of the reasons that we haven't seen terrible disease in the neuromuscular community is that this community is very, very good at keeping themselves healthy. They know, as Dr. Meyer said earlier, they know that they need to stay away from sick people. They need to wash their hands. They need to wear a mask. Even if you don't like to wear a mask, you don't be around people who aren't wearing a mask. You limit your associations and keep doing it. So those would be my main comments.
Yeah, and if I may add, I would recommend that they do that even after being lucky enough to be vaccinated. Continue with the diligence around this year.
Yep.
Could I ask if anybody would comment on when we feel that younger people may be able to get this vaccine and other, rare disease youth?
So maybe I can comment, Michael, if that's okay, just in terms of our plans. I think early on, we determined that it was going to be important to move into the pediatric age group. I think it's important to remember that even in the context of the overall pediatric age group, fortunately being largely spared, when one takes that writ large across the entire spectrum, we know that there are children that have severe disease. And so it's important that we do our very best to try to get a vaccine into those age group to offer that protection. And we did, although it's not completely elucidated, there may still be some importance in transmission, particularly in a school setting and the like. So being able to use a vaccine, if it actually can block infection and transmission, that could be helpful. So all of that said, very early on in collaboration with the FDA, we built in, as part of our fundamental study, a 12 to 15-year-old age group. And I'm happy to report we've completely enrolled that age group. It's 2,000 children randomized 1-to-1. It's our intent at the time we moved from emergency use authorization to our licensure application to either in association with that application or shortly thereafter file to get an indication in 12 to 15-year-olds. So then we would have the spectrum of 12 to 17. And our intent is to do this in time and with cooperation from the FDA, if all goes as planned, to be in a position before the start of the next school year that if the ACIP were to see fit to recommend, they could recommend that children in that age group receive the vaccine. I think the bigger challenge is then moving down into the younger age groups. We typically do this in a staged way because we want to move from potentially the less vulnerable older children to younger children in an expeditious but safe fashion. It's our intent to start looking in the 5 to 11-year-old age group with the study start in April. And again, that's partly based on we want to submit the data that we have to the FDA before moving into that younger age group to, again, just further verify the safety of doing so. That may well require, though, a dose ranging study, because we anticipate that we may actually need a lower dose in young children. And we know that reactions tend to be more common in the younger age groups. Frankly, I was pleasantly surprised to some extent. We were very deliberate about going slowly in the 12 to 15-year-olds because I was a little bit worried that we might start getting more reactions that could slow us down compared to 18 to 25-year-olds, but it turns out it's very close. So at least again, this is blinded data. I've not seen unblinded data, but compared to what we saw with blinded data in that age group, it's looking very close. So that's the plan. So I think if all goes as planned, one could anticipate the potential for 12 to 15-year-olds being able to be immunized by the fall. But again, we have to go through the appropriate filing and regulatory approval. And I think it would likely be next year sometime before we would actually have a vaccine that would be available in the younger age group, 5 to 11, and then even later for younger children, younger than 5.
Well, thank you for that, Bill. I must say that it actually answered a question I hadn't asked yet, and I was going to about a weight-based dosage for younger patients. If I may, while I have you, just one final question from a Pfizer perspective. The company's unique in that it's currently running a phase 3 worldwide trial with a mini gene therapy for Duchenne patients. Is there any comments or guidance you could give to families out there who are thinking about their vaccination status and how it may impact clinical trial entry?
Yeah, I think this is something that, regardless of the clinical trial, where it's a Pfizer trial, and obviously we're very proud to be working in the gene therapy field, and hopefully that will prove a great advance. We actually, Pfizer-wide, recognizing that emergency use authorization is kind of a peculiar space, and Peter can speak to this better than I, it's still investigational. And we have within our protocols, basically provisions typically that individuals cannot be part of another investigational study. And so we've actually now built in language that we think will pass muster, where depending on the nature of the protocol, there are ways that we think that people should receive the vaccine. After all, we're saying that individuals, even though we don't have data in terms of the immune response in individuals that are immunocompromised, that the recommendation from the ACIP is that those individuals should receive the vaccine. So my recommendation would be that for those individuals contemplating trials, they should talk to the investigators about what the provisions would be for receiving vaccine as part of that particular trial, because there may be, for certain types of drugs, washout periods that would need to happen before an individual would be eligible. Clearly, we don't want to unduly delay the ability for people to receive the vaccine. Each of this will be individualized. But I'll say Pfizer as a company, I expect other companies are doing the same thing, have taken this very seriously across all the protocols for all the other drugs and biologic agents that we use to build in provisions to figure out how people can receive the COVID-19 vaccine, our vaccine or other vaccines.
Well, thank you for that. That's really informative and real important for a community that's listening for this and how it actually affects not just COVID, but what their participation in really important clinical trials. My time is pretty much expired. All I want to say is thank you to everyone that's been on this. This has been incredibly informative, I think, for the community. I really appreciate every one of you taking your time and answering the questions and giving some thought into this. The last few minutes of this, I want to hand over to my colleague, Tiffany Cook. Tiffany's a mother with a young adult who's got Duchenne, and she's going to share her experience with her recent vaccination. I think it'll be enlightening, for the community to actually hear that this is progressing and how her and her son have responded. So Tiffany, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And yes, Dr. Matthews, I got vaccinated. You can't see my sticker. We were offered it and we did it. So, and yeah, just to really, it's just so heartwarming over here sitting as a mom. My son and I, we live in Dallas, Texas, and I have cardiomyopathy as a result of being a carrier of Duchenne. Will is 20 with Duchenne, also with cardiomyopathy. And so it was just a seamless process. We were notified via our MyChart, hey, the COVID vaccine is here, it's ready for you. Next thing we were notified, come in on January 13th and get it. We both went in, we were able to go in, very seamless process. He's non-ambulatory, so it was very accessible. We just went right in. We were able to go into the cubicle together because we were both receiving. I asked, if I weren't receiving, could I stay with? And they said, no, if you weren't receiving, we would have to separate. But we were both receiving, so we both went in, we asked questions and both received it. And then we were monitored for 15 minutes, had no reaction, and we left with our appointment for next time. We go back February 10th. So we get the flu vaccine every year. That's protocol, right? And really was no different than that, honestly. And just an amazing experience. And I yes, like Dr. Matthews said, if you have the opportunity to get it, don't turn it away. Take advantage of it. I'm truly blessed to be living in an area that it was open to us. So, but anywho, I'm going to go ahead and close our webinar today. Thank you guys so much again. This has been absolutely phenomenal conversations. I know, being a member of the Duchenne community, I speak on behalf of everyone, like Deborah. Just thank you so much. We are updating information on our website, cureduchenne.org, our COVID-19 resources. This webinar will be hosted there for viewing again after today. And then we will also be collecting all of the questions. So I know there's so much changing constantly. So do feel free to submit your questions. The CARES team and every member of Cure Duchenne is here to support and help and get the resources that you need. So again, thank you to Michael Kelly. Your moderation was fantastic, as always. And I appreciate everyone listening and letting me share our journey as well. So Deborah, you want to say any final comments?
No, again, I just want to thank everybody on this panel for appearing today, but even more so for your work on getting this vaccine to the point where it is right now. It's been phenomenal. It's been, close to a miracle, and we appreciate your dedication. And we have actually invited the panelists here to join us after a few weeks or a period of time when we might have some more news. And I believe that they've all agreed to do that. So circle back shortly, and the way things are moving, I think we'll have some progress reports coming up very, very soon. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.